Welcome to this tutorial about the Spectral Resonator. What I'd like to do today is take a quick look at the old resonators, take a look at what they can and can't do, and briefly compare this to the new device. Then we'll talk about each of these parameters and what they do in detail, and then maybe we'll go on to some fun sound examples and some little tricks. So the old resonator is basically a bunch of short delays. So what I've got here is an operator that's just putting out, turn that off, just putting out white noise. And what the resonator does is have a very short delay that's tuned to the right delay time to make a note, which is set here. And the feedback on that delay is this control, which affects how resonant or ringy it is. There's also a filter in this delay which damps the resonance so that the high frequencies drop off faster than the low ones. And you've got a bunch of these so you can set up chords. Which is nice, but one thing that bugs me about this device is that you can never quite get a completely tonal sound. There's always something of the original white noise present, and this gets even more so when you reduce the decay to something very short. You don't really hear the tones at all. So something we wanted to achieve with the new resonator is for it to be a device which takes in any input and really imposes tonal qualities on that sound. So let's take a listen to the new one. So that's kind of similar. Let's do an A-B. So it seems a lot more tonal in a way, so even at short decay times there's definitely more of a pitch to it, and then at really long decay times it becomes very pitched. So just the same as the old resonator, there's a decay time, there's a pitch, and there's high frequency damping, which is kind of the equivalent of this color knob. There's also low frequency damping, where the low frequencies die off quicker than the high frequencies. These can be combined. You look at the spectrum for the old resonator, you see these spikes, and each one of these is a resonant frequency. So if we put this in linear mode and take the pitch up, you can kind of see that all of these frequencies is evenly spaced, which is a harmonic series basically. And this is what happens when you have a really short delay with a high feedback. And this is why it's called a comb filter also, because it looks like a comb. In the new one, you have exactly the same thing. Except in the case of the new one, rather than this harmonic series being generated by a delay, it's actually being generated as individual sinusoids. So this is being created as a spectrum with spikes in it, and then it's being turned back into audio. And the nice thing about this is that you can affect each of these sinusoids individually. Let's go back into the log domain. So with the harmonics control, we can say how many of these spikes we want. And then add them in one by one. Another thing we can do is stretch and compress this harmonic series to get inharmonic sounds. At 100% stretch, you've got only odd harmonics turning up. So this gives you a sort of square, wavy, pipey kind of sound. And then at negative values it compresses. Eventually at minus 100% you get just a single sine wave. Another thing you can do with the fact that you can control all these sine waves individually is modulate them each individually. So this is this section here, the modulation section, which has 3 modes. First is chorus, which creates a kind of chorusy sound, or flangey. And with the pitch mod set to 0, it's just modulating the amplitude. So you can see these sinusoids jumping up and down here. And with pitch mode, pitch it a bit up. Get more wonky stuff. And wandering noise is a bit like chorus, except instead of being modulated with triangle waves, it's modulated by random ramps. So if we listen to just 1 or 2 sine waves. And what this is nice for is when you increase the unison. So what unison does is add more sinusoids or partials at each of the harmonic points, but at each of the harmonic frequencies, but slightly detuned. So you can see each of these spikes is becoming wider and more wobbly and indistinct. And then when we add modulation, it modulates each of those unison sinusoids individually again, so we get even denser sounds. So there's both detuning of the unison here and also with the modulation. So granular modulation is modulating the amplitude again, but this time with a decaying exponential, and the decay is set with this decay control as well. So every frequency is pinged at random rates, resulting in these little sort of plucking sounds. and the moderate affects the density of the grains from very occasional to dense. And this is happening individually for all the unison, so the more unison voices you have, the denser this will become. One thing to note here is that unison and modulation are doing different things to the partials on left and right channels. I think QuickTime is only recording in mono for some reason, so you won't hear that, but it's a shame because it does sound quite nice. So let me go over here and put a filter on the white noise. So we've got a resonant low pass, and now the spectrum of the input looks like this kind of spiky triangle with a peak at the resonant frequency, and then it falls off towards higher frequencies. And then if we look at what happens to the partials in the resonator, we get exactly that shape reflected. And this is basically how it works. It takes the shape of the input spectrum and it sets the amplitude of all the sinusoids to follow that input spectrum. So if we change the frequency of the filter, we'll see it change the shape of the output of the resonator. And then the decay happens after that, so you'll hear the filter kind of ping the decay. There's a second way of sweeping this filter, and that's this shift control here. So what this is doing is shifting whatever the input spectrum shape was up and down in frequency. And it doesn't matter what shape or what sort of distribution of the partials you have, so if you kind of create crazy tunings for this, you can still shift the shape. And what I've done here is had wandering noise modulate the pitch in a quite dramatic fashion here, take the moderate right down, and then you get a bunch of partials that are really weirdly spaced and sound peculiar. Rather than waggling this pitch control like a lunatic, I would prefer to be able to feed the pitch with MIDI. So the way I do that is set the pitch mode to MIDI, and choose a MIDI track that I want to get my MIDI from. And I'm going to use the track that I'm on, which is this operator track. And now the pitch of the resonance follows the MIDI. And in monophonic mode you get some glide. But you can also choose polyphonic mode. And despite the lack of the MPE thing here, we can feed MPE. And control the pitch of the individual voices individually. is still with fairly boring input, which is just filtered white noise. So let's move on to something maybe a bit more groovy. I have a loop here which sounds like this. And then I resonatify this. Add a MIDI sidechain. Turn that off. Do all that kind of stuff and then add unison. So one thing to note with the polyphony is that the more polyphony you have, the less partials per voice you have. So if you've whacked up your polyphony to 16 and your unison to 8, you don't actually get too many partials here. So it sounds a bit muffled. So let's back off a bit on that. And then so yeah, all of that kind of fun. One thing to note is that in mono mode, if you're playing your input, then you will get some output, regardless of MIDI, unless you turn this MIDI gate on. So with the MIDI gate on, you play the loop, nothing comes out until you hit a MIDI note. And in poly mode it's like MIDI gates on all the time, so you always have to hit some note to get something out. So that's a drum loop. But what if we feed it with some melodic content? Well, here we have a guitar loop of some description. So whatever we feed this is always going to come out to be whatever our MIDI note is. So let's try that. So there's this interesting interaction between the harmonics in the input and the harmonics that you've set the spectral resonator to. Let's have a look at a spectrum. So if we look at this spectrogram display here, we can If we change the dry wet control, we'll see a yellow spectrogram, which is the dry input. And when we add the effect, we see the blue spectrogram, which is the wet signal. So a bit like a comb filter that combed out everything that wasn't in the harmonic series, this is combing out everything that's not in the whatever the partials are set to. So you get something loud when the input harmonics here line up with the harmonics that you've set the resonance to. So what if we want our resonance to follow what the guitar's playing? Well, we can use the convert melody to new MIDI track or convert harmony to new MIDI track and see what we get. So now we have some MIDI, which is what our guitar was playing. Let's listen to that. What we could do now is route that MIDI into this thing. So there's that, and let's see what that sounds like. Beef up the polyphony. And then now we can transpose that MIDI anywhere we want, really. So you could completely transform the input, but stay somehow faithful to the melodic content of the input, which is kind of cool. An interesting thing that happens when you set a lot of these resonant modes down at very low frequencies is that you can create a kind of reverby, weird space effect. So we'll take our frequency down to something fairly low, whack the unison up to something high, stick some wandering noise on with a bit of modulation, and put our drum loop through it and see what happens. It sounds like we've completely lost all the tonal characteristics, but we have a sort of spatial characteristic instead. get pretty cavernous. Again, would be better in stereo, but never mind. So the next thing we're going to try is maybe the most obvious thing to try, which is routing my voice, which is coming in here on channel 4, into the Spectral Resonator and seeing what comes out. So you end up with something rather like this. It's a bit like a vocoder, I guess. Very like a vocoder, in fact. So then decay and damping to make it a bit more chunky. Then we add some wandering noise and get it a bit weird and wonky. And maybe route some MIDI into it. Here's our MIDI. Here's some chords. Here are some chords. Lovely, deep chords. Precious, melodic chords. I think you can still hear my dry voice, so it probably sounds rubbish, but never mind. Never mind. I'd like to show you something that you could do with 2 spectral resonators in series. What I have here is a sample of me saying yeah, and then I have one spectral resonator which has the MIDI coming in from this clip, which has some pretty high ascending arpeggio notes, and that's sounding like this. Not very good, but then I add another one, and this is getting MIDI from this, which is just 2 alternating semitones, quite low down, transposed low. And what's going to happen is that the high harmonics in this high-pitched one are going to line up with the low harmonics in this high-pitched one are going to line up with the high harmonics in the low-pitched one, and that's going to sound like this. And then we can make it more funky by adding an LFO and then mapping that to shift. Incidentally, there is a limiter on the end of this device, and if you crank up the input end too hard, you will hit the limiter and that little light should come on. Currently in the beta it's not coming on. We're going to fix that later. I want another LFO and I want to modulate something else. I'm going to modulate the pitch modulation. So you can do quite a lot with 2 of these things. Perhaps you can do even more with 3. I don't know. I haven't tried it. Why don't you?